I think that in the next 5 years, I think year by year, we're going to go through a time warp. You're going to see radical disorder in the next 5 years as each one of those things comes to pass. First with the elections as we have, then we have the conflict with the geopolitical conflict, then we have the climate issue, which, by the way, is a very expensive issue. We should talk about how costly that issue is. And then we're going to have this issue of technology, which can provide the greatest miracle, but also is a weapon.
That was Ray Dalio, a billionaire investor and founder of the world's biggest hedge fund. He's got this bold prediction that the next 5 years are going to be a wild ride. Not just any ride, but one that could reshape the whole world. He says it's like a pattern, like how businesses have ups and downs. Nations do the same dance. They rise, they conquer, they become the big shots, and then, guess what? They hit the skids. It's a bit like a roller coaster, but with empires. And according to Dalio, it's a story that's been playing out for the last 5 centuries. Every rising star eventually falls, no exceptions. So, what's he really saying here? Buckle up, because things might get much more chaotic than you ever thought. Ray Dalio asserts that the downfall of every nation, empire, or dynasty is an inevitable outcome, typically occurring shortly after its inception. He firmly believes that the United States is on a path toward collapse, and this impending collapse is much nearer than many might realize. As outlined in his book, Dalio's theory suggests that the life cycle of empires consists of 3 phases. First, there's the ascent, when a country rises to power and establishes a functional system. Then comes the zenith, where it sustains the achievements that fueled its ascent. Dalio states that this stage marks the beginning of the end. Finally, the decline is characterized by mounting debts that make it increasingly difficult to borrow and repay. This period is marked by economic downturns, widening political divisions, and growing internal and external conflicts. Currently, it appears evident which phase the U.S. finds itself in. Ray Dalio recently spoke at the 2023 All-In Summit in Los Angeles, where he talked about the rise and fall of nations and the changing world order. He expressed concerns about the banking sector crisis, the country's massive debt, and the ongoing challenge to China and Russia's dominance of the U.S. dollar. Dalio believes that we might be on the brink of witnessing the decline of another great empire, with China poised to take its place. What people admired about Ray Dalio's presentation at the summit was how he used animated charts and detailed analysis to show the ups and downs of 4 major empires: the Dutch, British, United States, and Chinese empires. There's a clear pattern here. When one superpower is on the decline, another is on the rise, and eventually, it takes over from the failing empire. This shift happened with the Dutch and British, then with the British and the United States. Dalio strongly believes that the same pattern is now unfolding in the United States and China. Now, these are the usual steps that happen inside a country when it goes through these ups and downs. It all starts after a big fight, like a war, decides who's in charge, and sets up a whole new way of doing things because no one wants to challenge the new boss. After that, there's usually a stretch of calm and good times where people get used to peace and prosperity. They start banking on it, taking out loans to make the good times last, which usually leads to a big financial mess. The country's share of trade gets bigger, and when most deals are done using its money, it becomes the go-to currency, making things even better. But at the same time, this growing prosperity doesn't spread evenly. Some folks get way richer, while others are left with not much. So, a big gap grows between the wealthy and those who have very little. Sooner or later, that financial mess blows up, which means the government starts printing lots of money. This stirs up trouble inside the country, especially between the rich and the poor. Sometimes, it ends in a fight, like a revolution, to share the wealth more evenly. It can happen calmly, or things can get really messy with a civil war. Moreover, as the empire grapples with its inner turmoil, its influence wanes compared to the growing powers on the outside. When a fresh, ascending force becomes strong enough to challenge the reigning power experiencing internal troubles, conflicts often erupt. From these clashes within and between nations, new victors and vanquished emerge. Eventually, the victorious parties come together to shape a fresh global order, and the cycle begins once more.
So 3 things started to happen in my lifetime, our lifetimes, that never happened before. And I needed, therefore, to study them in history. The first is the amount of debt and money creation. Huge amounts of debt and money creation. Does that matter? What is the rise and decline of a reserve currency? How does that all work? I needed to see the cycles for that. The second was the amount of internal political conflict, in particular populism of the left and populism of the right. And a populist is a person who will not accept losing. They fight with their contingency, and that dysfunction and that lack of willingness to lose then had January 6th came out after the book, and there's a dynamic that we're going on for that. And the third, of course, is the great power conflict. In other words, the rise of a comparable economic and military power in the form of China rising and competing with the United States, which is also changing that world order. Those three things never happened in my lifetime, but are big things that are affecting things. When I went back in history, I said I needed to study how these things work. Sometimes we overlook the really big things. So I went back and I studied that, and I saw that there were two others that had enormous impact. The two others were acts of nature, in particular droughts, floods, and pandemics. And they killed more people, and they toppled more empires and changed more world orders than anything. And certainly, big issue now. And then number 5 is technological changes and how they evolve. So I needed to study those 5 forces. I saw that there's this cycle that repeats over for good cause-effect relationships. I don't believe in a cycle just because it repeats. I started to understand the cause-effect relationships.
Furthermore, Ray Dalio used 8 measures to gauge the strength of an empire. He averaged these metrics to determine a country's overall power. These metrics include education, innovation and technology, competitiveness in global markets, economic output, the share of world trade, military might, the influence of their financial center in capital markets, and the strength of their currency as a reserve currency. Dalio also noted a cause and effect relationship among these factors. Better education leads to stronger technology, boosting global competitiveness, economic output, and so on. Importantly, a decline in the first metric can set off a chain reaction, leading to the empire's eventual decline. During the summit speech, Dalio highlighted some specific signs of decline relevant to the current situation in the United States. Let's take a look.
For any country, and quite often many countries, because they go through the cycle together, as they did in the 30s, what happens is debt rises relative to incomes. And what that means mechanistically is that debt service payments rise relative to incomes. And so it squeezes out consumption as the compounds. And what happens is there's a realization that they have to print money. So I think you're going to see in the next downturn another move to print money. There are certain things that are going on now that means that the big risk comes when they don't want to hold those bonds anymore, okay? Because the supply-demand, think about that supply-demand. It has a deficit, it has to borrow, and so it sells its bonds. Who are the buyers of the bonds? Why do they buy? The buyers of the bonds buy because there's an attractive return. Not only do you have to sell those amounts of bonds, but when they start to realize that I'm not getting good returns on those bonds, they can sell those bonds. There are $31 trillion of bonds.
What would they own instead?
They always own tangible things, and those things can also be, it could be equities, it could be many other things. It could be gold, okay? Gold has always been accepted as a money because it's nobody else's. There's a saying, gold is the only asset you can have, that not somebody else's liability. In other words,
Right.
You're dependent on getting paid. Right. You can have that at intrinsic value, and for a long period of time, it's been valued and you can move it between countries. But also, different countries prosper. So you'll see the countries, some of the countries that we mentioned, they will prosper through that. The United States made most of its money because it didn't enter the war. It was before, on World War II and World War I, the United States became the richest country because of the money it made before it entered the war. So those countries will prosper, and in those countries, then certain real estate will prosper, hard assets. But where you have that is very, very important.
There's something about wealth inequality that I just wanted to get your thoughts on as well, which is, I saw a chart in The Economist recently that showed on a purchasing price parity basis, normalized across all the Western countries, that U.S. median income, so median, so not thinking about means, is now 45, almost $47,000, doing much better than Britain, most of continental Europe, et cetera, et cetera. So on a functional purchasing power parity basis, a lot of Americans are doing much, much better. There was like a UPS renegotiation for their labor contracts. Drivers can now make 180 grand a year. I mean, just, there's a lot of money to be made, but then there's this real but also hyper-perceived imbalance. And I just want to get your sense of how much of this is the social media phenomenon of just never having enough, and how much of it is true when you look at data like that?
There's a huge wealth gap, and the nature of our economy is producing this. So I can rattle off a bunch of statistics. What happened, as happens in these cycles, is that when you have the type of situation we have, the government will take on the debt and it'll send out the money. So the mechanics of that were that there was more checks and more money sent than there was loss of income by a lot. So a lot of money went out, and as a result of that, the financial conditions of the household sector improved, generally speaking, while the financial conditions of the government sector, the government got into a lot more debt. That's very classic at the end of the cycle. Because there's an imbalance between demand and purchases of bonds, there's the central bank buying those bonds, that monetization. Okay, so now that's what the wealth gap looks like. And also that also creates more of the inflation.
Right.
Because the household sector, by and large, benefits. But when you look at the differences, I'll tell you a personal case so that I can understand. I live in Connecticut, and Connecticut's usually 1, 2, or 3 in the richest states in the country. 22% of the high school students in Connecticut either have dropped out of high school or are failing classes with absentee rates of greater than 25%. The $600 million a year goes to incarcerations. There is a level below which no human beings should be allowed to, let alone raising kids and families. I live in Greenwich, Connecticut, a wealthy place. I think my number won't be up to date, maybe 5 years old. Per capita students in high school costs would be $24,000 a person. In Bridgeport, Connecticut, up the road, $14,000 a person. There were 60,000 kids in Connecticut that didn't have computers. How were they going to get education? The state wasn't going to pay for it. We philanthropically bought them. So now we don't create a bottom, an acceptable bottom. And the idea of equal opportunity, I mean, I was blessed with it. I think we probably all were blessed with equal opportunity. All you need is the parents will take care of you, go to a public school, come out to a world of equal opportunity and learn civility. If you have those things. So if you take all those measures and so on, the gaps in those things are greater than they have ever been.
Right.
Let me ask, so Ray, I think I fundamentally agree with your critique that America is looking more and more like a late-stage empire. Like a late-stage Roman Empire, we have this massive debt and we're debasing our currency. Like the Roman Empire, we have all these, far-flung military wars, which we lose, all over the world. We're racked by internal division. So I think I agree with that part of it. At the same time, we do seem to be really good still at technological innovation. In the last year, we've had this breakthrough with, AI, with large language models. I'm wondering, well, first of all, is that a mirage, or do you agree with that? And then if you do agree that we're still really good at technology, is there anything in the historical pattern that's like that, where you have an empire that's declining in every visible way, except for the one that really undergirds our power, which is technology?
Well, the late 20s in the United States is such a good classic example. We had more innovations, more all of these cycles. If I was to go back to the Industrial Revolution, late 1800s, and then you create, when there's a lot of debt and a big wealth gap, in 1907, you have the Panic of 1907. boom, you have you have this internal conflict, and you had the First World War. In the 20s, you had the same kind of late 20s. It was an era of great inventiveness. The other things matter.
So just because we're really great at innovation isn't going to save us if all these other things are broken.
It's a wonderful thing, but ultimately, we as a society, in aggregate, are spending a lot more money than we're earning. So, if we're doing such a good job on that technology, whatever it is, why is that happening? Okay, so now when you look at the debt, do you want to own the debt? Do you want to own that? When those who don't want to own it, then you have a financial problem. When you have a financial problem at the same time as you have a wealth gap and populism, that's a dangerous combination.
Ray Dalio firmly believes that the United States is headed for a collapse. He's convinced that as signs of this decline become more apparent, more investors, especially large institutions, will shift their money out of U.S. treasuries and into tangible assets like gold. This trend has already begun with central banks, who have been buying up gold for over a year. They have insider knowledge, and when everyone else finally catches on and shakes off their complacency, the situation will have deteriorated significantly. But if you seize this small remaining opportunity to keep investing in gold, you won't be among those who suffer the consequences. So, do you agree with Ray Dalio's predictions, and how do you think will this affect you? Feel free to share them in the comments section below. And while you're at it, make sure to smash the like and subscribe buttons down below. Additionally, if you want to know more about other economic predictions, I highly recommend watching this terrific video. Just click this video right here. Thank you for tuning in, and stay tuned for more exciting content in the future.